Welcome to the use of deferred dispositions in domestic violence and sexual assault cases in Maine. We are so glad that you were able to join us here today. And we would like to thank the Bureau of Justice Statistics for sponsoring this and all of JRSA's webinar series. We do want to let you know that the opinions expressed today are those of the presenters and not of the U.S. Department of Justice. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. With us here today is George Shaler. He is the director of the Maine Statistical Analysis Center. We also have with us Elizabeth Snell. Elizabeth works for George and also is the Senior Policy Associate and directs the VAWA Measuring Evidence Effectiveness Initiative at the Cutler Institute. We are very sorry that Robin Dumont, who was supposed to join us today, had a family emergency and is not available. But with that, I'm going to step aside and pass things over to George.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. And let's see here. So I have, oh, here we go. This is what I wanted. And so do you see my, once again lost, Susan, what screen are you seeing right now?
We are seeing your slides, but not in slideshow mode.
Okay, thank you. And let's get there then. All right.
Perfect.
So thank you, Susan. Thank you for the introduction, and I appreciate it. So what I'd like to talk about today is an exciting project that the Maine Statistical Analysis Center did that we wrapped up earlier this year. We were approached, Elizabeth and I were approached maybe 3 or 4 years ago by the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence to ascertain the impact of deferred disposition. And I'm going to get into what that means here in a moment on future criminal activity, specifically among offenders who are given deferred dispositions for domestic violence and sexual assault offenses. So a deferred disposition case typically involves the accused pleading guilty and agreeing certain conditions to be met over a period of time. Typically in Maine, it's a year. Sometimes it can be a little less, sometimes a little bit more. But if the conditions are met, the case is either dismissed or the charges are reduced of a lesser crime. So say, for example, someone was charged with domestic violence assault. If they meet the conditions that are outlined by the judge, by the courts, they might end up with a simple assault, as an example. If the terms are not met and the person goes on to violate the terms of the conditions, or they commit a new crime, the original charges go into effect. There are a number of reasons why jurisdictions may offer deferred dispositions to defendants, and each case, crime, offender, and victim undoubtedly will pose different circumstances. But the overarching hope behind this type of sentencing alternative is that the deferral of jail time will steer offenders away from future criminal activity and offer the opportunity for community diversion programs such as addiction treatment, community supervision. The court also recognizes that a criminal record may hinder the offender's ability to obtain jobs and housing, both of which contribute to the stability that facilitates law-abiding choices. So when we got approached for this project, we reached out to our District Attorney Association in Maine, which is the Maine District Attorney's Technical Services Unit, for data on this project, because what we were looking for is disposition data from the from the prosecutors on how these cases turn out. So this was the first time we'd worked with this group, and it was an exciting opportunity for Elizabeth, Robin, and I, but it also posed some challenges, and I'll get into those a little bit later. And also, before I proceed, I want to acknowledge again, as Susan did earlier, the Bureau of Justice Statistics for funding this research. We continue, even though this project ended back in February, we continue to get a lot of inquiry about this because the justice system here in Maine is looking for alternatives for the way certain offenders are treated. So anyways, let's move on to the next slide. So we looked at cases from 2014 through 2019, so a 6-year period. And what we found is that there were, we ended up with a deferral caseload of a little over 18,000. Our study focuses on the 6 years, but note that we are only analyzed cases that were closed. So some of the cases, we got our data set for this project in early 2020, right before the pandemic hit. So some of the cases that were deferred in 2019 were still active, and they were excluded from this study. So, there were roughly between, 3,000 and 4,000 cases a year that are being offered deferred disposition. And what we'll get into in a little bit, but I'll put out a little teaser, is that the use of deferred disposition varies across the state. Some prosecutors and judges have been more quick to check this kind of a sentencing alternative out than other prosecutors and judges. So let's move on here. So in Maine, we have 8 prosecutorial districts in the state, and they cover from anywhere from 1 to 4 counties. And for those of you who are kind of curious and may have heard of a couple of locations in Maine, Portland, where I'm located, is down in District 2 in the southern part of the state. It's the District 2 encompasses just 1 county in the state, and that's Cumberland. It's along with District 1, which is just York County. It represents a little over 1/3 of the state's population. Anyways, this was the deferred disposition caseload over the 6 years of the project. And a little bit of a surprise here, just on a proportional basis, is York County, which is again the county to the south of us, had more cases than Cumberland County. But anyways, this is kind of the breakdown, a little bit of the demographics on the cases over our study period. But what's interesting is to look at it by the deferred cases as a percentage of the total caseload in each of those districts. So Knox, Lincoln, Saginaw, and Waldo County, which make up District 6, which those of us in Maine call the mid-coast area of the state, actually just under 5% of all the cases in that prosecutorial district resulted in a deferred disposition. And you can see that up in District 5, Penobscot and Piscataquis, they made, on a percentage basis, less use of deferred disposition. District 5 is Penobscot, which is home to Bangor, which is one of the more populous cities in our very rural state. So just a little bit of background on some of the demographics of our caseload. A little more than 1/3 of the deferred population were female. 94% of them were white, which is proportional to the white population of the state. At the time of the 2010 census, This population of Maine was 95% white. It has dropped to 91% white. The median, as of the 2020 census, the median age of those receiving deferred disposition was 31. The mean was 34.18. All of these distributions varied a bit from district to district, and you can find out more about district rates in the appendices of the report. So let's move on. So now let's talk about the deferrals. So what were some of the offenses that commonly, now again, we were looking specifically at the DV and SA, sexual assault, but we were also looking at other types of deferred disposition as well. And these were the leading offense descriptions: theft, DV, assault. Obviously that fits into what we were most interested in looking at, criminal OUI, and you can read the rest of the list. So these were the types of cases that were resulting in the use of deferred disposition. Let's move on here. So this is on a percentage basis. We were looking at domestic violence again and sexual assault. You can see that 19% of the cases, the DD cases by district, were for domestic violence, but it ranged anywhere from 24% to 12% by district. And again, District 2 is Cumberland County, so 12% of the DD cases in Cumberland County or District 2 were for DV. There was a high, 2 counties, York County and District 3, which is home to Lewiston, Maine, had the higher rates. So let's keep going along here. So in looking at a smaller percentage of the cases included a sexual assault charge. The most frequently occurring charge were for unlawful sexual contact and the possession of sexually explicit materials. But, you know, by and large, there were not a lot of cases resulting in deferred disposition in which there was a sexual assault charge. So most of the cases that I'm going to get into are either the entire DD caseload or DV cases, a subset of DV cases. All right, let's move on here. So we'll talk a little bit about offense severity. We looked at the severity of each case. If the case contained any felony charges, that case was coded as a felony case. And about a fifth of all cases were felony cases, as you can, and then this rate was lower for DV cases. 16% of all the DD cases were for felonies. The rate among the few sexual assault cases that were in our cohort were the percentage that were felonies were a bit higher. But our understanding is that the deferrals are sometimes used not because this seems like the most appropriate sentence, but because it would be hard to prove the case if it went to court. This may be why that's reflected as a higher percentage of felonies. Let's see here. Let's move on to prior. So what we also looked at was whether the folks who were offered deferred disposition had a prior case that was tried at any time prior to the study period or during the study period. So if they were offered a deferred disposition in 2017, but they had a prior case in 2014, we wanted to look at those as well, just to see if people who were being offered deferred disposition were involved in prior cases. Oh, I'm sorry, I should. So in 67% of the cases, so 2/3 of the cases, the person had a prior. And so that could, in a lot of the leading reason for that was that they violated a condition of release, or they might have had an operating after suspension, theft, so on down the line. It was surprising to us as researchers, it was surprising that 2/3 of them had. But anyways, so that was, and that also about 1/3 of them had a prior felony too. So this sentencing alternative continues to be used even when cases, even when individuals who are committing crimes have had a prior case. And you can see what the prior case severity was. And again, oh shoot, I went too far. We were looking at the most recent prior, even if they had had several priors. Again, these are prior caseloads by district. The average was, so this is in regards to whether they had a prior DV case. And here's the breakdown. The average rate of cases with the DV prior was 13%, but it ranged from 9 to 17% from District 7 to District 8. And those two districts are the two northernmost districts in the state. Again, almost half the cases involved, almost half of the prior DV cases were felony cases here, which shows that the courts and judges, the courts and the DAs were willing to make several attempts to provide alternative sentencing to the people who are committing these cases. We looked at whether any of the individuals who were received deferred disposition had a prior sexual assault case, and by and large, the vast majority of them had not. Those that did, these were the offenses that they received. Let's see, let's move on to the next one. This was the breakdown. If they had committed a prior sexual assault, this was the breakdown of whether it was a felony or not. Now we wanted to, now I'll kind of take a look at, whether any of these people who were offered deferred disposition went on to recidivate. And you'll see that over half, almost half, did not recidivate. And these were some of the reasons, if they did recidivate, these were some of the reasons for their recidivism. The most frequent charge was violating conditions of release. Now we wanted to look at whether any of them who recidivated with a domestic violence offense. 11% of the subsequent cases held a DV charge, and a little bit more than half the subsequent charges were DV assault charges. That makes sense. We looked at whether there was any sexual assault recidivism, and it was only 1%. Breaking down that 1%, these were the charges that resulted. Again, it's not 25% of all of the recidivism, it's 25% of the 1%. So just wanted to point that out. All right. So we wanted to look at what predicts DV recidivism in the male cohort that we looked at. We looked at DV recidivism for both females and males separately because the predictors were different depending on gender. In the interest of time, I'm just going to cover the predictors for males. The findings for females are in the full report. There are a lot of factors that could be related to reoffending, and we expect age to be one of those factors. We expect that having prior cases to be another. And in order to pinpoint the factors which had an impact on recidivism, we use logistic regression. So again, looking here, we're looking at just males which recidivate or reoffend with a domestic violence charge. The goal of logistic regression here is to tease apart the impact of each factor, but sometimes you find that two factors that have what's called an interaction, which means that you really shouldn't separate them, and that's the case here. Let's start at the top and look at the cases in which the case is deferred with no DV charge and no prior charge of any kind. And the recidivism rate for this cohort was 3%. Or 3% of them were expected to recidivate. Now we'll look at the next bar down and looking at cases where there was a deferral with a DV charge, but no prior charges prior to that DV case. And the logistic regression model shows an expected rate of 10%. Now we'll look at the cases in which there was no DV charge, but this time with a prior case, and the expected rate is 13%. And then finally, we'll look at cases with deferred with DV charges and prior charges of some kind. And as you can see, the expected rate here is 23% based on the results. And I should explain here that the error bars, those purple bars, if you can make those out, are the first category with no bar is the comparison group, and each of the other categories compared to this one, you'll see is beyond the confidence interval for that group. Wherever the intervals overlap, the categories are not statistically significantly different. So none of the bars overlap with the end of the comparison group, the 3% group. So all three of the other groups are different from the first one. The next two bars do overlap, so these two groups aren't really different from one another, but they are different from the last group. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So age, again, we looked at different types of recidivism among age cohorts, and again, anyone who falls within the 20 to 29 category is in the age 20 cohort and so on up. And we found that age does impact recidivism. If you look at the error bars here, starting at the top, you'll see that the expected recidivism rates for a 20-year-old isn't different from a 30-year-old, but it is different from a 40-year-old. And the expected rate from someone who is 60 is about half of that for someone age 20. So anyways, so that shows some statistically significant differences for age. Now we'll look at race, and again, this is just for males. We looked at because Maine has a relatively small persons of color population. All people of color were categorized or were put into this one category compared to the white population. Race appeared to be a predictor of recidivism. One thing to bear in mind is that race may be correlated with socioeconomic status, which we do not have as part of our data set. So what appears to be an effect of race may very well be an effect of SES. So now let's look at predicting sexual assault recidivism among males. And again, this is for a relatively small group of folks. Those who were deferred with a sexual assault charge were more likely to have a subsequent sexual assault charge. Again, these numbers are relatively small, but in this case, there is a statistically significant difference. All right, so let's talk. I think one of the things that Susan wanted me to kind of speak to are some of the challenges in doing this research. And one of them was that the data were stored in a record management system database that is not easily queried. It's more of a record management system. The Maine District Attorneys Association is not used to querying data for research purposes from this data set, and it took about 9 to 10 months to come up with a query that we were comfortable, query results that we were comfortable with. Another limitation is that the data in Maine, the primary charge in some domestic violence cases is a general offense, such as assault, rather than a more specific DV assault. This suggests sometimes that DV cases may not have been categorized as such because the offenses in which a person is charged in cases involving domestic violence do not always relate exclusively to DV. These were mediated by some degree by the method in which we classified the cases. Specifically, if any offense in a case was DV in nature, the case was classified as such. The cleaning process for this was more challenging than almost any other single project I've ever worked on. And I have to admit, I'll have to come clean here, is I did not clean most of the data. My colleagues Robin Dumont and Tara Wheeler did, but some of the data that we ended up getting contained some string variables, the likes of which we've never seen before. Some of the string variables, once we downloaded them to an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, were multiple pages long. So it required a lot of cleaning. And then lastly, and so, I mean, on a more positive note, the DA, the District Attorney database, is being replaced right now with a database that we think, from what we've heard, will be better suited for research purposes, so that we anticipate being able to work more readily with DV data. And I should point out, this partnership with the DAs has led to another project that we are about to embark upon in 2022. We were fortunate to get an SJS, another SJS grant that will allow us to analyze DA data outcomes. And so we look forward to working with the DAs in Maine on that. And so let's see, I got another slide in here. Oh yeah, so this project has also led to some ongoing collaboration with our victim witness advocates that work across the state. That collaboration on the deferred disposition case is really serving us well. Elizabeth and I and a team of other people here at the Maine Statistical Analysis Center are doing a statewide victim services needs assessment, which is a really exciting project that's being funded by the state of Maine. It's also allowing us to do a new crime victimization survey in Maine, which we're really excited about. Elizabeth and I were meeting right before this meeting to kind of discuss some of the final touches to the survey, which will be launching in early 2022. Another kind of a positive in all of this is that the DAs are now more engaged around deferred disposition policy. Some of the DAs, as I pointed out earlier, were not using it quite as much, or just using it in a small number of caseload types. I think there's been greater interest in kind of seeing how deferred disposition is likely to lead to better outcomes in those cases in which deferred disposition may not be the appropriate sentencing alternative. And it appears that, at least from the initial feedback we're getting, is that the DAs are interested in using research to drive practice around deferred disposition, and they're interested in using research more as evidence, as I mentioned a moment ago, in our new SJS grant. So anyways, here is the last slide, and this is the report. It's on the Maine Statistical Analysis Center website. You can read more about the results in that. So I will pause there. Elizabeth, I'm sorry, I just like breezed through those. Do you have anything you want to add here?
No, I think you did a great job, George.
Thank you.
All right, George, we did get several questions in advance. And folks, if other questions have occurred to you, go ahead and put them in the questions tab and we'll ask them. And also, George, I believe that this report appears as a handout for most of our viewers.
Okay,
if
great.
They have not already clicked on the link or seen the report. The first question is, can you say more about the involvement of the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence and the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault?
Yeah, Elizabeth, do you want to take this one?
Sure, I'd be happy. So it sounds like the question is, the asker is looking for more information about the Maine Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
About their involvement in this
involvement. Sure.
In this project.
So, you know, as you can tell from their names, these are our Maine's state coalitions who each coordinate between 6 and 8 member centers each. The MCEDV has 6 to 8 member centers who are situated throughout the state, working in domestic violence, intervention and response services. I'm getting an echo. There we go. And MICASA, the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault, has the same 6 to 8 member centers around the state that are working in sexual assault prevention and intervention and response. And they are both longtime champions and supporters of the Maine STAC. We see them as very close partners. We often do projects with them. They'll come to us and say, we're seeing this happen in the field. We're not sure what to make of it. Can you help us think about how we might evaluate it? And we go to them to say, we're thinking about hate crimes or deferred disposition or what have you. What are your thoughts on this? So this project actually came about because, in part, because the executive directors of those coalitions raised this as a question to us. They were wondering how deferred disposition was being used in cases of DV and sexual assault in Maine. And their advocates and their colleagues had lots of questions about that. Is this an important tool in the toolkit? Should this be recommended for these types of cases? And that was sort of the seed that germinated this larger conversation, where we, after doing some initial literature reviews, we realized that there's very little research actually on deferred disposition or deferred adjudication in these types of cases, and we wanted to find out more. So they are our close partners, they are thought partners. We support them, they support us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the other part that I would add to that is that, like it's our hope that, I showed some logistic regression results, and that those, I think, results can kind of help DAs and judges realize, all right, we've got this kind of case, the person's got a prior, they've got a DV prior, and now they've committed another DV offense. Maybe deferred disposition is not appropriate in this case. So that's our hope going forward, is that they'll use those results to kind of figure out how to respond to each case going forward.
We had a related question regarding the recidivism. And how does that intersect with the victim and the community reaction to the idea of deferred disposition? So when you're studying recidivism, you have results of recidivism, and you know that the community's like, what should we think about this idea of deferred disposition? Are you seeing any impact of this research there?
Well, I think that's a little, the answer I would give is that it's, this report came out midway during the last legislative session. So has there been policy crafted to address that point? Not yet. What we have in Maine here is we have a biennial legislative session. So in the odd numbered years, new legislation is introduced. And then in the even numbered years, which we're approaching this year, bills are carried over that weren't acted upon. I wouldn't expect any new legislation to kind of result until the 2023 calendar year. If the DV and SA advocacy organizations put something forward. I think, there is some interest. I mean, we had, Elizabeth mentioned the victim witness advocates. They reached out to us soon after the report was released, and they wanted a special presentation to, how many VWAs are there, Elizabeth? There's
about 66 in Maine.
Yeah. Yeah, so they wanted a special presentation to kind of talk amongst themselves and hear the results, because, I mean, these are issues that are very germane to what they do in their role of providing victim services to people who have been subjected to DV. So I guess that's how I'd answer that. That's a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, I should be more concise.
Well, I have a slightly different approach, if I can hop in, Susan, or not approach, but a slightly different answer, because I started my career as a domestic violence and then sexual assault advocate. And, I think that every case is so different, right? I mean, we're trying to sort of parse through, and as George said, find some ways to provide some guidance or suggestions. And I have worked with victims in court who have said, I'm begging for a deferred disposition because this person, who happens to be the person abusing them, is my ride in a rural county, or income, or other half of childcare, right? I mean, there's so many nuances. And then I've talked to other advocates who think, why would we offer a deferred disposition in a case of domestic violence if that person has already been charged with a protection from abuse order? Some people say that's a deferred disposition in itself. That's a warning. And if they violate that, why did they get another chance, right? So there's so many nuances. And what I appreciate so much is this interest from the VWAs and the prosecutors' offices in this research and in thinking about working with victims to get their perspective and their preferences in their specific situations.
Well, speaking of nuance, another question that came in is, what percentage of the domestic violence and sexual assault offenders in the study were already prohibited firearms possessors? Did you get into that at all? Or
That's
might
a
it
great
be possible
question.
to look at
No,
that?
we didn't look at that.
I don't think that was even part of our data set, was it, George?
No,
I don't know if we were able to get it.
Yeah, we did not ask for those data. And
I'd
love to see those data. I mean, it was, we had to request an extension just because the quality of the data that we received required a lot of massaging, if you will, and cleaning. And I don't know if the DA database houses that data. I'm not sure.
It may not for the look back, but as George mentioned earlier,
yeah,
if a phase 2 comes around,
yeah,
the data should be a lot more consistent.
Yeah, the system that they have in place right now is rather advanced in terms of age. I
call it mature.
That's right.
So there was a question about the types of data included in that MEDATS repository, but I guess you said that they've already, probably in part due to your work, realized its limitations and are now implementing a new system.
Well, I mean, I think, it would be giving us far more credit than we deserve. I mean, they had plans to kind of overhaul the system, before the study started, but I mean, it certainly, I think, pointed out to them the limitations of the system in terms of using it for research purposes. So, like, we're hopeful, in the next couple of years that, as we embark upon other possible research projects, both SJS and non-SJS related, that, we can get easier and more, faster access to data.
Well, it was very encouraging to see that you are seeing this higher interest among the DAs in research, because, for historically, they have not been open to research, or in so many instances not wanting to open their files or have some, so that's very encouraging.
Yeah, Susan, that's a really good observation. I mean, and the DAs, I think, and this is part of, I think, a more national movement to be a little bit more transparent with their data. One of the DA from Cumberland County was the one who approached me about doing kind of like a DA case outcome study, and he quickly lined up all his 7 other colleagues. This was at the time that he made this request, he was relatively, well, he still is new. I mean, he's still serving his first term as DA. But, there's been a little bit of a sea change here in Maine in terms of DAs being more transparent with their data. And I'm optimistic that that'll continue, and hopefully this latest study that will start in January will further that.
That's great.
Yeah, it is great. Yeah.
So we had a number of people who just said they wanted to know more about the methodology. So what advice would you give to your colleagues in other states, other jurisdictions who wanted to take on this kind of research?
Yeah, I guess one of the first things, so what was exciting about this project is that it was the first time that we were working with this group. And so, I think from a methodological, well, this isn't strictly like hardcore methods, but, it really required brokering a partnership here. We reached out to the guy, the programmer. We first of all, we got the buy-in from the lead DA. The DAs have a kind of a professional association, and it's a rotating position. And the DA at the time, who was kind of chairing the association, I approached her about, kind of this partnership, because we needed her to get, at the time, to kind of get on board with this, and to kind of realize the potential benefit of it. So we got that. That was important, And then, we needed to kind of, we needed to approach the programmer, who was not used to kind of doing this work, And I mean, he will run very kind of like, very kind of simple reports that have already been canned, that are canned reports. But this was not a canned report. And so what we ended up doing is, he was a little uneasy at first with us because, he kind of thought that if he made a mistake and we got the wrong data, it might portray the DAs in a negative light. So that's why we went back and forth on several different queries. And, we had follow-up meetings each time he ran a query for us, like saying, this is how we're seeing the results of, this guy's name is Joe Miranda, and we were saying, Joe, this variable, is this what this means? And so we go through that. So, from a methodological standpoint, is we went through several iterations of the query. But I should back up just a tad bit. We did ask to kind of see the database, because we weren't really completely certain of what was in the data. So that also was a step in the process. So I don't know if I've completely answered that, but I mean, we really focused a lot on partnership building, because that's going to help us with this next project. So,
and in order to sort of make those initial inroads with Joe at MEDATS, he really wanted to make sure that his colleagues, the prosecutors, were on board. And so we spent quite some time then making sure that the coalitions were advocating for us too, right? Like they have spent a long time establishing strong relationships with the DA's offices. And so part of our ask was that they do some of the groundwork first and say, we really want the Maine SAC to study this. This is really important. And it can improve outcomes for victims, and it can also streamline things for your office.
That's really great to hear about that example of relationship building and trust forming and the long-term plan for that.
Right? Yeah.
You know, where you invested in those earlier relationships with the coalitions that can then help you get the trust of the next group you want to work with.
Yeah,
that's the benefit of being in a small state. You know, like, Elizabeth has worked quite extensively with our the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence and the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And we have, we have a growing history with those organizations that, because there's only 1.3 million of us here in Maine, we see them quite a bit, even during, whether it's now virtual or not, we're in frequent contact with them.
We also had quite a few people say, oh, they just wanted to know more about the findings. So you did say that the findings about the priors were surprising to you. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I guess, like when we saw, like to me, I came into this, I guess I had the perception, and this was really off, I'll admit that, I thought deferred disposition was going to be offered to more first-time offenders. And so I was really surprised when we pulled in the priors data with our DD caseload that 2/3 of them had a prior. Like I was kind of expecting maybe 40 to 50%, but I was surprised. And so these are individuals that have been given multiple opportunities to kind of get it right, so to speak. And it shows you that the DAs and the judges will go to great lengths to try to help someone kind of steer clear of future criminal offending. So I guess that was one of the surprises I took away from this, is that I thought the percentage that it was basically for every 3 offenders, 2 of them had a prior, or for every 3 DD offender, people offered DD, 2 of them had a prior. So.
Elizabeth, was there anything that surprised you about the findings?
Well, although the data set was massive, I still felt constrained by the time period. And George, you'll have to remind me of this. So deferred disposition is still relatively new in Maine.
Yeah, it is.
Was it 2008?
No, I think it was even later than that.
It might have been 20.
It wasn't widely used until about the time that our study started.
Yeah. So I'm yearning for another point in time, right? I want to see how things are shifting. And there were so many other factors that we can't capture in a straightforward data set. Deferred disposition is used really differently in the different districts. And Maine is a state where you have some counties that are quite urban, which is, still nothing compared to New York or Massachusetts. And then we have some counties that are incredibly remote. And I'm curious about how specific offices are using deferred dispositions and in what way, and what sort of subjective decisions folks are making, whether that's because of capacity or different kind of cases they're seeing.
Yeah.
And of course, one more thing.
The defense attorneys too. Yeah, the defense attorneys are, getting in, asking for that as well.
Yeah. And I also just think that sexual assault is still a bit of a black box, right? Like the number of cases that are actually charged and actually go all the way through the system, we know are such a small fraction of the sexual assaults that are actually occurring, that we just, our N was so small.
Somewhat related to the N being small, but were there other factors that or elements that you tried to examine and either there wasn't enough data there or it was inconclusive, not statistically significant, that you think maybe a few more years of data might help?
I wish Robin was here.
Yeah, I wish Robin was the lead analyst on this. Yeah. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I mean, like it would be nice to know, it would be, like as I mentioned in one of the slides, on race, for example, we did see using the logistic regression model that people of color recidivated at a higher rate. I would really like to know if that was because of maybe socioeconomic status as opposed to race. There are other variables that I would love to see that I don't think the MEDATS data had, so yeah, I would like to see, some more variables tossed into the logistic regression mix to see which ones surface or not.
And, as you probably can tell from what I've shared here, I am not an evaluator, right, by trade. I came to this work through advocacy. And so my questions were, well, what does monitoring, how would monitoring influence the outcomes of these cases? Some offices, like I mentioned, are so tiny or are serving such a huge, vast landscape that deferred disposition monitoring consists of a check-in here and a check-in at the end. Best of luck to you. Where other places like Portland, there are dedicated monitors who are routinely in contact with these folks and who are like really invested in helping them meet the terms of their deferred dispositions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, Elizabeth, because that I think is something that we kind of recommended in our report, is that there should be some more like kind of monitoring of, of certain cases or certain individuals who are offered DD based on, whether they had a felony or not. And, that might enhance the chances of success because, as Elizabeth mentioned, in some areas, they're just not offered much of anything. They're just basically said, stay out of trouble.
Right.
We don't want to see you, basically, and hope that, after 6 or 12 months, they've managed to stay out of trouble. And we know that, for some people, especially younger individuals, that's sometimes a tall task. Well,
that was going to be another one of my questions was, what are the conditions that they need to meet? Is it ever more than stay out of trouble? And did it seem to vary across the jurisdictions? Were some ordering successful batters treatment or anything?
Yeah. I mean, it really is case dependent. And especially you would, like I would assume that with DV cases, that was probably a common occurrence. But, like for other cases, maybe it's, staying substance free during the period. It may be that, some individuals have to check in with a probation officer or something like that.
There could be substance abuse treatment. I know that there's some online virtual programming for like theft prevention and shoplifting education and things like this. I mean, I think it really runs the gamut.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it looks like that's the end of our questions. I want to thank you all so much for sharing not only the report, but then these insights that can get the rest of us thinking about how could we look into this, because the use of deferred dispositions and other alternate sentencing, I think, is just of growing interest right now with all this criminal justice reform. And then to take on an examination of these cases of particular interest
Yeah.
I think the rest of the country thanks you for going first and doing some of this work. And let's hope that this spurs some increased examination of this.
Well, Susan, thank you for your interest and inviting us to speak. We had a lot of fun with this report, and hopefully it's just the start of a deeper dive into the use of this tool.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, with that, folks, we're going to close today's webinar. Please do remember to take that feedback poll and have a good day. Bye, everyone.
Great.